The Journey of Square Peg, Chapter 3. Moving on. By late spring it was becoming clear to me that the tightening spiral of angst my country was caught in was not going to change. Prompted by the economic attrition of rising fuel prices and food scarcity, our standard of living, like most other people, was falling. One morning, sitting in our dining room, I was contemplating the threadbare carpet and our lack of funds to replace it when my wife walked in. "They've invaded," she said, speaking of the escalating situation in the Middle East I had mentioned a few times to her recently. "They say it's about human rights and freedom, but everyone knows they just want the oil." I listened to the radio show host echoing around our kitchen. She was quizzing a senior politician who parried her questions with the stubborn lack of a straight answer of a seasoned professional. "Well, Minister, while I have you," she said, changing tack to get round the stone wall of noise without answers, "could you give a quick comment on the industrial strikes in Manchester and Birmingham today? With that and the ban on biofuel crops causing unrest too, surely things are looking a bit of a mess for the government." The answer was unusually candid for his kind. "Well, as we've already discussed, food production must be our first concern. Imports are now so costly and unreliable, the nation must do what it can to feed itself, even if that does entail a lifestyle change for those used to using their cars whenever they like. I'm sure your listeners will agree that a car without fuel is preferable to a stomach without sustenance. On the industrial action, I would say that as a nation, we are facing difficult economic and social times that demand difficult decisions, including what taxes we charge on manufactured goods. These strikes and any other attempts to circumvent or undermine our government's attempts to resolve issues that affect all sectors of society are to be condemned. It is very disturbing that the mindset of the 1930s fascism has apparently resurfaced as a result of our shared suffering, and I don't doubt this is partially behind the militancy we are now witnessing. What we should be doing is working together, digging for Britain both practically and metaphorically, as a nation, rather than allowing our emotions to divide. And what about our part in the Middle East crisis? Should we be getting involved, or do you subscribe to the Britain First rallying cry of those so-called militants on strike?" interrupted the interviewer. "Well," he replied with an edge of irritation in his voice now, "if I may just finish my sentence, I would add that the same could be said for international relations. Rather than nation states or groups within them attacking each other, we ought to be coming together to resolve our common problems collectively, something our counterparts in the Middle East should be giving due consideration to rather than fighting each other. As for our support for factions over there, the fact is, acting in our national interest does not equate to pulling up the drawbridge and simply taking everything we can from others. It is about acting in a way that builds bridges that will serve us well in the long term. For that, we need to engage others. Hiding from or dismissing other nations is the reaction of those with an unsophisticated and incorrect understanding of international politics and what is best for our country." His loaded comment was on the mark. Alarming Cold War alliances and tensions seemed to be rising on the world stage. Perhaps it was just as well that there didn't seem to be enough fuel for an extended hot war these days. It seemed to me that the trade-off was a lack of food imports and technology exports, forcing humanity ever further down a road back to the past. Our once great, technically advanced country was slipping back towards an agrarian state, with tangible effects on our quality of life and infrastructure. The pothole roads and queues in the hospitals said it all. We needed alliances and we needed help. We would only get that if we gave it in return. In this background of degradation, you can imagine my thoughts when Helen, all auburn hair and lip-biting uncertainty, followed the end of the news with her own announcement. I half expected her to hand me a petition for divorce. Instead, she nervously announced, "I'm pregnant." She was sitting down across the table from me. Joy, shock, excitement, and fear effervesced in my head at this sudden news. No mention of missed periods had been made. I had read the atmosphere as more of the same decline in our relationship, yet this was great news, and not even a hint of regret passed through me. I was thinking that no matter how little money we had, we would find a way to cope and love the new baby in our life. But what came out of my mouth could, in hindsight, have been a worrying response for her. We have to move to a bigger house, I answered, clearly not displaying my happiness enough. There was more to this statement than simply the need for more bedrooms, though. I'd been thinking for a while that we clearly needed land to secure a future food supply for us, at least enough to offset the worsening shortages, somewhere we could grow vegetables, hunt and cut wood. This news, which I failed to hail vocally as the wonder I really felt it was, would surely now force the issue. Helen, clearly not having heard what she wanted from me, rolled her lips, nodded, and stalked quietly out of the kitchen. I should have followed her to our bed, to which she retreated in silence. I should have reassured her, but what good are such regrets now? As time passed and Helen's bump grew, it was clear neither the financial rewards nor the working pattern of my job in the service promised to suit the circumstances of our growing family. We needed more money and more access to opportunity. It wouldn't be a bad thing to dodge the well-known phenomenon of working a lifetime of night shifts, then dropping dead within a month of retiring either. I began, therefore, to contemplate a change of career, but when to leave the service. Though stressful, by that time I was a paramedic, and my work was never boring. That meant a lot to me. I needed a defining reason to take the leap. It didn't take long before another near miss with my dangerous colleague provided it. The 4 a.m. call to the station from a paediatric consultant at a local A&E boded well in terms of permanent change. As I lay in the reclining chair in the dark station, I knew exactly what the call was about. I was still tense from the shock I'd had earlier that evening. Having driven to hospital, I'd been watching my colleague through the mid-hatch of the ambulance, chatting away to the mother of a child we had picked up because he had difficulty in breathing. The child had seemed very unwell to me. We had given it a nebulizer. The paramedic's demeanour told me everything I thought I needed to know. He was relaxed, so the child must have responded well to the salbutamol inhaler. I did not hurry in. But a well child was shockingly not the case I found, having opened the back doors of the vehicle on arrival at the hospital. In amazement, I found it with critical breathing difficulty, pyramiding, and looking utterly exhausted, while the oblivious clinician small-talked with the patient's attractive mother. Immediately recognising the signs of severe distress in the child, I rushed to decamp them all, charging with the patient into the A&E, pumped with fight or flight urgency. I think if the glass door had not opened as fast as it did, I would have smashed right through it. Panic ensued as a crowd of medical staff hurriedly assembled from the far reaches of the hospital to attend the child. As I lay there in the pool of light from the open door, I listened to my colleague murmuring apologies in the office. I wondered how it could be that he had managed to stay below the radar long enough to become my clinical superior. It was a position never justified by my experience of him. To the angry caller, he promised to study the treatment of acute asthma and to pre-alert the hospital next time. Evidently satisfied, the consultant did no more. The one opportunity to remove a dangerous chancer from the service was lost the moment he put down the phone, and I knew things would never change. Despite his promise, I never witnessed my colleague reading a manual unless it was related to fixing cars, and felt powerless, hopeless. Recognising the risk he posed for me, I tried quietly to extricate myself from working with him any longer, but the good people in the service were always taken advantage of. Decent managers were sidelined and non-stick shit promoted by the ex-army types that looked after their own. I got nowhere because I was a square peg that asked difficult questions of senior managers more used to receiving unquestioning obedience. They had no desire to help me. They wanted only to squeeze me out as a misfit, and this presented the means. Despite failing in my bid to move onto a shift pattern that did not partner me with him, it would not be me that pressed the issue openly by complaining about him, for I knew the fate of becoming a pariah awaited anyone who raised concerns about colleagues. No matter how incompetent or bullish the perpetrator, to raise it made you a grass, and that was worse. This made calling an ambulance a dangerous lottery, stacked in the patient's favour only marginally by the emotional and mental sacrifice of those clinicians that were blessed with self-awareness, professionalism, and intellectual curiosity. Thankfully, such high-quality people maintained a slight majority within the service, but the risk of going down with this liability of a man was too much for me, for surely my luck would run out eventually. The response of my managers was all the excuse I needed. My departure made no waves in a profession getting too used to an exodus. The day I bid farewell, I was disappointed, jaded, and unafraid all at once. It wasn't my first change of career. I had form, and despite deciding to jump, I felt like a failure as yet another career path came to a dead end. But at the time, I didn't doubt I would find something. I just didn't know what or how long it would take. The interviews came quickly, more through curiosity at my paramedic background than anything. In the end, being selective became an impossible luxury. At the time, I felt no joy at the prospect of finding a new role on old territory, but this move would have a more profound effect on me than I had anticipated. I never used to like to fail, and I still don't like to, but I'm not afraid anymore because I realised I can learn from failure. I've taken these lessons and used them to make me adaptable and effective. I feel ready to do this job. I'm in the right place at the right time with all the skills and experience you need. I'd forgotten how well I lie. Sitting there in that tired office chair, I felt utterly distant from the right place, and I noticed as I gazed down for a moment of relief from their stare that my watch had stopped. As I bid for that sales job, I was bombarded by sensations of repulsion at going back to something I'd done many years ago. I'd come full circle with little to show for the journey. Had they known how helplessly fickle I could be, they would not have looked favourably upon my application. It was better not to mention that by this time I actually felt drained and hopelessly unprepared to join their ranks. I was just hoping to find the strength to do well once I got back into it. The lack of positive outlook yet again gave me one key step forward in my life though. It was understanding. By this time I began to recognise that my view of situations and people and my ability to deal with them positively had been coloured by a burden I had carried with me for a long time. Insipid and ghoulish limbs of depression attacked in endless waves in what seemed an eternal and relentless tide. The interviewers could not know that, as I now realised, I was a functioning depressive, able to be lively and affable as I sat answering their questions, as an apparition of the mentally, physically and morally exhausted me. You see, I've come to understand that depression is a huge handicap. It mostly goes unnoticed because it isn't always obvious that a person is depressed in Western culture. We think of being morose, confused, lethargic and cynical as just part and parcel of a normal reaction to modern life. But depression intensifies these feelings and clouds attempts to improve one's lot. As I sat there, waffling something affecting, I felt dead, stifled by my tethers to the greener grass of my childhood and the silvery leaves of an idealised future that remained elusive. That's interesting. Tell us, what attracted you to this position? The executive's nose, red and bulging, was crisscrossed with the thin purple veins of a drinker. The desperate nature of my position, I wanted to confess. I was tired of myself for being unable to find a job I liked, for lacking the contentment that seemed so easy for others. My work in the service had been my only success and had gone off the rails. Everything else had been temporarily positive. Yet again I was at the beginning, on a perpetual journey whose path led me back to the start, no matter which route I chose. At first I'd been successful in work, but more recent years of false starts and failures took my self-belief and turned it into dissatisfaction with everything. Life had beaten me down because I wasn't the right shape to fit anywhere comfortably. In fact, ever since I left university as a mature student, I had felt utterly lost and without hope of finding my way forward in the darkness of the careers landscape. I was oil on water, and I lacked a plan. Thinking back, maybe that is why I clung on to the notion of having to prepare for the end of civilization. I needed a reason to get up in the morning to face another difficult day dealing with my life and my wife, hampered all the way by omnipotent low feelings. Perhaps I was preparing not so much for the end, but an end, where I would check out of life as most live it, to cut a new path rather than cycle back. Until I got to the point of writing this all down, I thought I'd learned to live with this poisonous aspect of my character much better than I really did. It dwelt like cancer in my soul, and the further society slipped into turmoil, the more I felt in danger of being overwhelmed by the darkness within me. I never felt depression was something really dangerous for me. I had too much to live for, felt too obligated to my children, but I would far rather it did not dwell in me, because, you see, a depressed person must fight a personal battle before, during, and after committing to almost any action, and that is wearying to say the least. The solution I hoped a well-paid selling job would provide, for earning good money always cheered me up considerably, did not come to fruition. The economy saw to that. The good times I remembered from my youth were certainly over, and it didn't look like things would ever recover. Our nation was truly in decline. Selling premium products is a tough job in a struggling economy. You have to work with the expectations of the backseat drivers who run the companies and who blame any lack of orders on you because they judge everything by how easy it was to compete when they were on the road in a thriving economy. For them, statements of reality were mere forays into a valley of excuses rather than a genuine indicator from the workforce that old approaches no longer worked and needed to change. Their demands ignored all common sense, and they were in denial about what they did themselves to damage their own competitiveness. It was easier to scapegoat the messenger and spend time warming the seat in an office, daydreaming about spending the millions, than it was to effect real improvements. Given that, the new career fell victim to the same capricious nature that killed off my joy in the others. Determined to stick it out despite the bad management, I found it offered certain key advantages. One was the improved basic pay, which helped us to move house. We were able to afford a decent sized plot, which I hoped would yield a good crop to subsidise our meagre weekly shop. In addition, I was free to roam as I saw fit, using opportunities to travel for work as a means for viewing potential tools for the first key stage of the plan I had now formed over many years. And so I stuck it out, making enough money and contacts to secure the things I needed at trade prices, not to mention getting an awful lot of useful advice from various experts in their field. By the time our baby arrived in a whirlwind of drama later reflected in her character, after all, it can be observed anecdotally that how we enter the world greatly shapes us. We were settled into a detached house on 1/3 of an acre. We named the baby Rose, and she was loved and cosseted as only a family can do. At the time, another less wanted new arrival made its way onto the stage of our lives. The high-pitched tone, which had drifted in and out of my head occasionally in the past, decided one day to stay. I remember where I was when it happened. The day tinnitus came to mess with my head was as momentous an occasion as the assassination of JFK had been for others, for me at least. A little research taught me that it could kill through depression and that it was likely to remain. I had two choices. I could let the new status quo destroy me, or I could accept that it was what it was, that I could not change it, and determine that I would not let it beat me down. I chose the latter, and for the most part I have kept the upper hand in the battle of my will against this cruel, invisible entity. Sometimes being bloody-minded is an advantage, and in this case it was, but my flat spin continued unabated, testing me and affecting my family life, and it coloured Helen's view of my spending behaviour, especially when it started to limit our shared lifestyle even further, for I had spotted a trend that threatened us all, and I had felt compelled to prepare for what was clearly coming.